In the mid-80s, a certain arcade title emerged that became quite a big hit called Spy Hunter. This game went on to receive an arcade sequel and a few NES ports as well. However, it would be in 2001 that Midway and developer Paradigm Entertainment would bring the franchise back in a big way for the PlayStation 2, and several months later would be ported by Point of View to the GameCube and Xbox. So, did Spy Hunter return as sleek and stylish as the Interceptor you'll drive, or does it malfunction like a Toyota Prius? Let's find out. In Spy Hunter, you play as Alex Sex, a former F-15 fighter pilot now trained International Espionage Services agent, or IES, that drives the G6155 Interceptor, a sleek, stylish, and downright sexy vehicle that is loaded with weaponry and surprises. The evil Nostra Corporation, run by Damon Curry, is hell-bent on fulfilling prophecies and is planning on unleashing the Four Horsemen. These missiles will act as an EMP of nuclear proportions and send the Earth back into the Dark Ages. The cutscene after the first tutorial is essentially the most exposition you'll get from the game, but that's more than fine for this kind of game. It sets up the basic story premise and lets the gameplay just do the talking itself. I will say, I love the continuation from the original 1983 game, as it is mentioned here. In between missions, you'll basically just see cool CGI cutscenes of the Interceptor finishing that mission. Now, Spy Hunter's gameplay was originally a top-down action racer, firing away at Nostra agents while using oil slicks and accessing the weapons van. All that and more return in this installment. The game kicks off with tackling a tutorial mission, letting you get your bearings for the Interceptor. However, this is not some easy tutorial that slows down or stops the gameplay to teach you everything you could do. We didn't really have that kind of hand-holding nonsense back in the early 2000s, at least not that you needed it for every single game. Initially, the vehicle is equipped with machine guns and oil slick, and as you progress through the story, it will get new weapons added on, as well as abilities. The Interceptor handles like an absolute breeze, and in some ways showcases how handling should feel for all cards in video games. It's immensely responsive and does the actions you need it to with absolute ease. You'll hit the gas with the A button, brakes with the B button, the R trigger will fire your primary weapon, and the L trigger will change your primary weapons. Now, holding down the Z button and then pressing the R trigger will fire the rear weapons, and holding down Z and pressing L will cycle between the rear weapons that you can choose from. Since the PS2 original utilized all 4 shoulder buttons for these actions, the conversion to the GameCube with this setup actually works quite well. Additionally, you will utilize actions with the X button, like firing tracking devices or using infrared lenses, and using the Y button will allow you to lock onto enemies and objects if you have a weapon with lock-on capabilities. Now, each mission will have a primary objective to complete while having various secondary objectives, such as collecting SATCOMs, destroying X number of objects, enter a base undetected, minimize civilian casualties, and much more. Missions will have you globetrotting from the USA to Frankfurt, Germany, Venice, Italy, the French Riviera, and the Panama Canal. Completing just the primary objective will essentially let you complete the mission, but the game's progress is dependent on the total number of objectives completed before you can unlock the next mission. While this may sound like padding the game a bit, it actually allows you to keep replaying missions to discover the various paths that lead to the secondary objectives and perfect your runs. Throughout missions, you will be swarmed by enemies that are ensuring they can do everything possible to stop you in your tracks. As mentioned, the Interceptor is well equipped, both with dealing against enemies in front of you and those that are trailing you. As stated, as you keep advancing through the game, you'll get new weapons and upgrades. These can range from unguided missiles to guided cluster missiles to railguns, EMPs, flamethrowers, and more. Finding that balance of which weapons to switch between and utilize is the key to success. You will have a limited amount of ammunition for each weapon type, including the standard machine guns, but the ammo capacity provided is a healthy amount where it feels just right with the overall mission structure. During missions, you will come across the weapons van, which is the main way to replenish your health and ammo for all weapons. When your Interceptor takes too much damage and drops to about the 35 to 40% health mark, it will disassemble parts of the car and transform it into a motorcycle of sorts. This will make the vehicle a little bit faster, but also limits the weapons you can use until you reach either a weapons van for repair or complete the mission. Additionally, the Interceptor isn't just for land, but rather can transform into a speedboat when approaching bodies of water. This happens seamlessly in the game, and it really adds this level of versatility to the overall gameplay, going in between land and water and vice versa. As you progress in the game, you will receive an upgraded Interceptor 2.0 vehicle with different abilities and features, providing more variety within the overall game. In terms of replayability, Spy Hunter does have cheats that you can unlock. To do so, you can check the cheat grid in the settings, and it will show you the times you need to beat in each mission to unlock that specific cheat. Now, this is where the whole replay a mission over and over from earlier comes into play a bit more. It won't be just the time you need to achieve, but rather completing every objective in a single run while beating that time. What I like about this is that while it takes some practice to pull off, it starts to look like you're flowing smoothly and stylishly through levels as you would expect the Interceptor to look doing so. Some of the cheats are humorous, while others are neat, like the extra cameras one where you can change to a camera setting that is actually top down, and it replicates the look of the original Spy Hunter game. Additionally, there's a 2-player competitive option here, providing players with 3 modes of play: Spy 2 head-to-head, Globetrotter, and Chicken Hunter. Spy 2 head-to-head is just a straightforward one-on-one match where you both race for the finish line of a level and see who reaches it first, but you will also be able to utilize your Interceptor's weaponry to take out your opponent. Globetrotter is all about who can collect the most SATCOMs littered throughout levels, and Chicken Hunter, well, it's all about who can take down the most chickens. Although, with how expensive chicken is nowadays, I'd maybe collect my earnings instead of leaving them on the road. There are a few cons about Spy Hunter's gameplay to note. First off, while there's a nice variety in the missions themselves, there are a few locations you will revisit that are just tweaked maps of prior missions. I wish they were able to make each mission entirely different map-wise, and while the mission structure here is still great fun and a blast to go through, there is this slight bit of sameness that hits during your playthrough. Second, while I loved seeing the Interceptor receive upgrades each mission, revisiting previous missions will only let you use the upgrades provided at the point of that mission. So, while at the end of the game the Interceptor will have every weapon and upgrade possible, you can't revisit previous missions with all of these upgrades, and that's kind of a bummer in some ways. Third, I actually wish the game was a little bit longer. There are 14 missions, and while replaying them to complete all the objectives and learn each route will demand multiple playthroughs for those missions, the gameplay loop is just so damn fun that I wanted more of it, especially when you finally fully upgraded the Interceptor by the final epic mission. The final gripe in particular is in terms of the GameCube version's content. Point of View handled bringing this game to both the GameCube and Xbox, and both have interesting aspects to note. The Xbox version, for example, received an arcade port of the original Spy Hunter to unlock and play, whereas the GameCube version, well, received absolutely nothing additional from the PS2 original, and actually received a bit less since it's missing the making of Spy Hunter video. Additionally, there were graphical differences, so let's dive into that. Alright, so this is a game that I played like crazy back on the PlayStation 2, and I recall experiencing this version for the first time at a friend's house when he rented it on the GameCube, and if you've played the PS2 version and you've watched the review up to this point, you'll notice that the visuals have received quite a downgrade. Now, we know the GameCube theoretically is more powerful than the PlayStation 2 hardware, but the porting process clearly felt rushed here. The texture work and filtering in this port is some of the worst I've seen on the GameCube, with ultra low res rendering and lots of pixelization that would make a 3D Sega Saturn game envious. The ground and trees look almost like 32-bit texture work. Additionally, the game is much darker looking than the PS2 original. The lighting and color palette just seem a little bit off and far less appealing. Furthermore, the frame rate is erratic. Instead of a locked 30 frames per second that it was on the PS2, the GameCube version has an unlocked frame rate, and it typically hovers under the 30 frames per second mark, yet it sometimes hits close to the 60 frames range. The frame drops happen so frequently though that it does ruin the fluidity of the gameplay at times. It's a shame because while the PS2 version wasn't this amazing looking game, it was a rather good looking game, and the GameCube should have been able to handle this without any issues, furthermore with 60 frames per second locked. The cutscenes are all very heavily compressed, and while this one I could have understood a little bit, the PS2 version's file size is 1.25 gigabytes. A GameCube disc holds 1.46 gigabytes. There should have been no reason for all the compression here, and it's actually inexcusable. Now, in terms of comparing point of view's port for this game on the GameCube and Xbox, the Xbox version does appear to have more of the proper texture work that's found in the PS2 version. However, the Xbox version is by far the darkest looking one of them all, and not an inviting one on the eyes. Also, due to the placement of the black and white buttons, it makes using the rear weapons a bit less intuitive. While the GameCube version does have an inconsistent frame rate and low-res textures, surprisingly, it's definitely more enjoyable between the two here. Now, outside of these visual differences all around, Spy Hunter's actual graphical direction works really well. The interceptor design is downright amazing, and seeing the vehicle transform or alter based on weapons selected is really sleek to see in action. The environments overall are designed well with great level design and thematic settings. The various enemy vehicles are also designed pretty good for the most part, but they can have some jerky animations, while the actual people firing at you are on the lower end visually, which again is understandable given how fast you'll be going to take foes down. And that's the trade-off here as well. For a game that's all about going fast, blowing up almost everything in sight, the low-res textures will start to become less noticeable since the game is so fast-paced and you're laser focused on the action on screen. In terms of audio, the soundtrack here does a fantastic job of immersing you into the gameplay. Whether remixes of the Peter Gunn theme, to the techno-like score, to the badass Saliva rendition of the Spy Hunter theme, it all really is memorable stuff. The sound effects all do a great job as well, between the sound of the interceptor driving around, to the various weapon fire, to the interceptor's system voice that lets you know if you've completed an objective, anything up ahead to know of, etc. It really adds to this level of immersion and intensity of the gameplay. Also, seriously, that Saliva rendition of the Spy Hunter theme, this really requires you to crank up the volume to the max for. The music video that is here for them is one I've watched countless times alongside my brother when we played this in the PS2, and it still holds up exceptionally well. It also makes the final mission feel far more badass and fits perfectly. The main gripe I do have with the audio really lies within the port itself, and that's the compression. This is specifically with the game's cutscenes having a much lower bitrate than it should. Spy Hunter is a prime example of how you take a retro classic and modernize it while retaining everything that made the original iconic and upping the ante. The gameplay is fast and frenetic, and while short, is challenging enough to keep you busy completing all the side objectives and tackling the fast times to beat to unlock all the cheats. The biggest issue really resides with how this specific port was handled. The game is completely playable, and the controls translate really well from the PS2 to the GameCube, but the erratic frame rate and sloppy texture filtering really do detract from what is already an awesome game overall. If you have a PlayStation 2, I'd highly recommend playing this as the original developers over at Paradigm Entertainment intended. If the GameCube is your only avenue, then what's here is still a damn good game.